Alrighty, so within a lot of ancestor veneration, there's essentially 5 different types you're dealing with at any given time. There's the type that most people think of when they think of ancestors, which is the ancestors of blood, your direct family line. The song "Mothers and Fathers of Old" is essentially that is your bloodline. The next one is the ancestors of spirit or heart. These are your friends, these are your pets, these are your lovers. Some people will argue that adoptive parents would go there, even though they can be family. So some will argue that they will go in blood, though. It depends on your own personal choice on that one. Some people over time do end up with a lot more people in the ancestors of spirit and heart than others. It's just a fact of life on occasion. There's the ancestors of place. So those are the spirits that created the place that you live in. For me down in Whitby, one of that is Peter Perry. He was the one who actually founded Whitby as the port town for GM. In ADF, we have what are known as the Ancient Wise. So these are the poets and magicians and priests who were the ones keeping all the bargains before us. They were the ones who were making sure sacrifices happened and keeping up the old stories. When priests of ADF die as well, their funerary rites, they get inducted into the Ancient Wise. So people like Eric Canale, also known as Eric of Pittsburgh, or Isaac, or Raven, or AJ, they all got inducted into the Ancient Wise as newer members. Many who work with them, the Ancient Wise will give them guidance, depending on how. It could be, those who are of bardic nature, or it could be other priests if you've got a problem. One of the last categories, and this is the one that people don't typically think of, is the restless dead. So these ones are the ones that are more kind of stuck. So most people will feel like the restless spirit, that you're not quite sure what the heck's going on. This would be those ones. They are not easy to deal with. And typically when you're starting out with ancestor veneration, you don't want to go for these ones first. Go for your happy relatives and friends. Because these are the ones that it's better to have the really strong relationships with your allies before doing so. And that way they can be the ones protecting you in case there's issues. In most Whispering Lake Grove and Order of the Dead rituals, there is a magical mist that is worked with. And for Whispering Lake Grove specifically, there's the Hounds within the mist. And because Whispering Lake, as the founders of the Order of the Dead within ADF, work with a lot of the dead, we also work with the restless dead on a rather regular basis. So that's why we have that mist, so it's, once again, like a typical ADF ritual, an impermeable or a permeable barrier, but so we can send out incense and stuff like that as a, hey guys, here's your due, we're not forgetting you exist. But at the same time, they can't get in towards us because of the hounds. They are essentially, if you think of the idea of limbo, they're the ones that are stuck in it. And that's why on occasion they're more tricky to deal with, because they're not in that timeless place. So one of the lines that is used a lot is, what is remembered lives. And it's of that idea of what is remembered is given offering, it is given actual energy from yourself to keep going. And so some of the ways of doing this is different types of ancestor veneration. Many will have ancestor altars, so depending on how they personally practice and their own past, this can include, but not include, those of blood. It can include those of spirit. It can include those of the wise. I personally have a list. I have 4 different shelves. And so I have one that is my specifically well-honored ancestors of spirit, which I actually call it the dead lovers shelf. The one above that is my family. So I actually include my pets on that one. Not everyone will, but that's where they fall with me. On the other side, across from the dead lover's shelf, is all my neighbors and the friends that aren't on the dead lover's shelf. They are on the other spirits of heart piece. Above that, I keep a list of my dead because I've run out of room. So, but ancestor altars and having those mementos and having those memories and those memory jogs are a definite good way of doing some of the ancestor veneration. Other things such as cemetery walks, visiting the graves of those who you are actually connected to. You can run into the restless dead depending on the cemetery. If you don't feel good entering it, don't. Because there could be something there that's just a little off or mad at you. But you can also include ancestors of place in that way. So if you're deciding to, look into the history of your location, you can find out where that pioneer that started your town or city is buried. Writing things down and doing an ancestral calendar. So you have their birth date, you have some memorable dates for them, you have that death date. So that way it's specific dates and times that you can make sure you honor them throughout the year if that's how you choose. We currently have a written culture. Not all cultures did back in the day, but we do now. Write the stories down so that you don't forget them, or write them down so your descendants can see them. It's one of those things that we can use now, especially with the advent of technology, to pass this stuff on. One of the other ADF priests she went to a local gravesite on Memorial Day and photographed all the old graves of all the old veterans who had passed away and were in that cemetery, and put them on Find a Grave so that their descendants have a shot to find them. Because in some cases, you might know that, say, your family's buried in Ottawa, but not know what cemetery. Or that they're off in some tiny little town, but there's 7 abandoned cemeteries in that town. Things like that are one of those ways that you can actually assist in descendants also being able to track backwards. Now, there are different high days and whatnot that deal with ancestor veneration. Those who are Irish Celtic in nature, Samhain. Most of them are right around that end of the harvest time period. And it depends on the hearth culture that you deal with, how your dead are honored. So, for example, the Norse. They've got certain different pieces that are how they deal with their ancestors. The Vedic, the ancestors actually live in the highest heavens instead of in the underworld, because they've got a different cosmic picture. So they've got some of their things reversed. The Romans didn't actually speculate much about the fate of the dead, but they still paid them enormous respect because they weren't sure if it should be out of respect or out of fear to make sure that they didn't come back. They're one of the ones that their Feast of the Dead is not in that darker timing, just because of how their schedules of things happen. And though not Indo-European in nature, there's still ancestor veneration in other cultures, such as Mexico with the Day of the Dead, Días de los Muertos. India now, even though they had the Vedic before Hinduism, they don't pray to their dead, but they have specific mourning rituals that they do at the 1-year mark. But for example, without that calendar that I stated earlier, it's harder to do that yearly remembrance. Vietnam doesn't even do birthdays. They only do death days. So within ADF, the Order of the Dead is one of the magical religious sections. So it's one of our subgroups. And the members are specifically dedicated to reviving and recreating ancient Indo-European ancestral traditions. So we've been striving to try and create traditions and practices, especially as people age and as they're needed, or as natural disasters happen, or as people, have health issues, stuff like that. At this point, to my knowledge, I'm the only one up here in that order. But it's because I'm so close to the actual creating grove. Many of the order members end up having their own specific practices that will fit to their specific hearth cultures.
Up here in Canada or up here
in Canada specifically? Yeah, up here in Canada. So most will have their own specific things with regards to their hearth culture, of prayers that they want to say, things like that. However, there currently are 2 rituals. It's the joining rite and the solo rite. At this moment, there are a couple more being written as to group rites that can be done, so that you've got more of a capability of doing something with a larger group to still venerate the dead of ADF. Ancestor veneration or ancestor worship, depending on the wording you want to use, can be seen across cultures worldwide. Dancing Lights, we have an ancestor book that you can have a page per each of your dead, so that they're all in one spot. I know other groups have their ancestor box, and it goes to certain grove members, and it gets opened at certain times of the year, or things like that. In years past, Dancing Lights, we were outside, but for the purposes of us, we moved our ritual location for comfort, because Canada is cold, and it also let us redo our ancestor altar. Years ago, we used to have awesome ancestor altars, but because of slightly changing weather, we had been having really cold, drizzly Samhains. And so when we moved back inside, it was easier to make sure that the mementos that we had of our loved dead didn't get damaged. And so keeping the relationship to the person through the little mementos we still have left can also be a thing. And that's some of the things that I put on my shrines. It's things that remind me of them, or that they gave me. Like one of the items that I actually have up on my ancestor shrine, one of my ex-girlfriends loved owls. And she is within my honored dead. Those that are here and will be in the ritual tomorrow, will hear her name on the list of the 80th ancestors. She loved owls. I had commissioned a little felted owl that sits up on that shelf. Up on the family shelf above that, I have a little jar of one of my cat's fur, because we had the option to have it done. But it's those little things that you can say, oh, I remember that. And for example, with the cat fur bottle, I have it as specifically his white fur, because he was my first cat that had white fur. But he was also the first cat who ever turned pink when he decided to get into the juicer after Mom had used beets. So he was known for dyeing himself in different foods. But it's one of those, it's a memory trigger. And whatever the memory trigger is for you is that memento piece. I personally also do a Weeks of the Dead. So right around Samhain, when that chill is hitting the air, right before there's going to be the big celebration, I go around to the local cemeteries. But I also work with the restless and unknown. So I will actually leave flowers at some of the older grave sites in the area, so that they know, hey, there's actually someone paying attention. So if they are still around their physical form, they know, oh, if this stone gets too bad, someone will actually make sure I'm not totally forgotten. The first one I always do, because he's the pioneer of my area, is Peter Perry. I hit his gravesite first, do all the older ones in that specific area, and then I move out. It's the first one done at the first days of the ancestors. Some of the other ones, there's an abandoned cemetery just north of my house, like way north, but north of my house. And it's being cared for right now by my city, but it's completely abandoned, unused. I think the last date in it is something like 1893. It's that old. And it's starting, you can see some of them are starting to fall to ruin. But the grass is still mowed. So it's making sure that those you need to be remembered are still remembered. It gives them that connection also. So when you do open the gates and you do call for the ancestors, they can come and stand with you. They can make sure if you are the last of your line or something, that you don't feel alone. Because they're still standing there with you. So, does anybody have any questions? And are you okay being on, because I've,
Sure.
Okay.
With these restless spirits, would they have any effect upon your personal being, let's say, if they were part of your ancestry, or not ancestry, but part of you?
I haven't had any issues with regards to any of mine that were restless beforehand. There were some in my line, and I know there still are some others. Typically, those in your own line, they're like, oh wait, you're one of my descendants. So even though they're kind of stuck in limbo, they're not as restless towards you because you're their own line. So when you're using, say, mothers and fathers of old, their grandparents, aunts, uncles, etc., and even if they're in limbo, they still count in yours. When it comes to the restless dead, it's more those that are in limbo that have no hope in hell of knowing you. So, XYZ person at the grocery store whose grandma's stuck in limbo. That might be a different story because you have no familial connection. You have no reason for them to say, oh wait, you're one of mine. You are my own family. That does come into play a little bit differently when you've got adoptive situations or, there's any sort of issue with familial connections because of histories. But in those cases, some people will say, well, I have no ancestors of blood, but I have ancestors of spirit. And those are the ones that I'm going to invite to stand beside me. It's those people, and one of the reasons why I put the actual list of the 5 types of dead up top is because for those who do have those more issues with their familial ones, they may have that, I have no ancestors because of a situation that happened to me when I was young. And but do you have friends? Have their families accepted you? Do you have any honored dead that are not blood related? And it's those ones that you can then call upon instead. I do know that there are people who have said, I don't have ancestors. Because of that, they immediately think that blood. And that's part of the reason why, we like stating specifically also that it's spirits of heart.
So one thing I'm actually curious about, because I found that taxonomy that you led with interesting. And to what degree is that and the other theology you guys are working with based on lore and historic practice, and to what degree is it modern theology? That's because I'm curious on there's obviously some of both playing in
there's
it.
some of both. For different places where we have some of the rites, some of it's going to be modern theology and the recreation of things. Yeah. Most definitely, we are ADF. We do recreation.
Yeah, exactly.
It's what we do. But at the same time, it's going to be seeing where those traditions lie and what we can bring in from each one. With Spring Lake, for example, for the gatekeeper for their rites, does not use a tradition-specific gatekeeper on purpose. That way, all of our members across the thing, no matter what our hearth cultures, can work with the same gatekeeper, because that way it's not hearth-specific. But that's one of those. It will depend on cosmology exactly the rite that happens.
Yeah.
Because, for example, if you're working with someone who's Hellenic, they'd have the Omphalos. And that's where you make the little ties in for the specific hearth culture of the person. So, any other questions? Okay, we'll go Sadie.
Curious about the energetic protocols that nDraíocht teaches you to use or that you have adopted on your own.
And that's one of those, that's where I said have really darn good allies. If you have decent allies, no matter what type of allies they are for you, if you do decide to work with any of those spirits who are not as friendly, they're the ones that are going to be going to bat for you typically. And that's why it's find the ones that are more friendly first if you're starting it. The one thing I didn't mention, because for some reason I didn't get there, emotionally, this work can suck. And I'm literally just going to state it like that. It can suck. Especially if you're doing something like an ancestor shrine, or you choose to do a scrapbook and do an ancestor book, things like that. Making sure that piece is that appropriate memory trigger for everything you want is hard. Honestly, give yourself the space to cry. Give yourself that, frustration if you're just trying to get it right. Because that means you care. When I do it, yeah, you'll see me break down. And it's one of the reasons why typically if I'm leading anything that I'm specifically naming or telling stories, I will break, recollect, and keep going. But I've been doing it for a while. And sometimes if it's new enough and hard enough and painful enough, you can't. And that's where you have to go into this mode and then recollect and come back. So it's one of those, it's a tricky balance to learn, and when it's that fresher, newer state, it's hard. So one of the things that I put was finding the perfect thing for the altar can be hard. Finding the perfect memory to hold on to for years can be hard. And not having the space you want can also be hard. Because if you want to dedicate space and you don't have it, that can hurt. So sometimes you have to make the space even if you have to give up something else.
My question was, you're focusing a lot, obviously, on veneration, and so a lot of the goals, it seems, is one of gratitude and thanking, right? So for the gifts that you have, for who you are, where you come from, and then the other one is about empathy for the dead and for their place. But there's a third component to Indo-European beliefs, and that's the necromantic sort of sorcery. You get the dead to do things for you, and they may not want to. So I was wondering if that is part of the practice, or is that something that you stay away from, or that type of sorcery?
I personally go with the ghosty aspect of it, of I give to you so you can give to me.
Mm-hmm.
So if I need to go ask most of my spirit allies are the dead, I'll just flat out say it.
Mm-hmm.
If I need to go to one of the dead and state, hey, I need assistance with this, I will come with a gift for them in order to get that reciprocity. So with any of the spirits, I and many others will typically stay away from the, hey, go do the thing,
Mm-hmm.
versus the, hey, I'm bringing you a thing, would you mind giving me a hand? And we go with the ghosty principle of reciprocity on, guest host, hey, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. So, are there any other questions?